right.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate that you all are taking time to address this topic that has long needed to be addressed and is only being highlighted by current events. Um, Real quick, just quick introduction. I'm Stephen Brackett. My performer name is Brer Rabbit. I'm in the band Flowbots. I am the director of special programs for Youth on Record, and I'm also the Colorado State Music Ambassador.
And my name is Brent Adams. I'm the director of programs at Youth on Record. And for those of you who don't know, Youth on Record is a social justice music education nonprofit in Denver, Colorado. We provide music education in schools typically that would not have it otherwise. All of our courses take a explicitly political lens and framework. Yeah.
So we're just going to kind of hop right into it. We want to start off with just why do we need to refuse white supremacy? And in saying why, we want to actually highlight where we think the question most needs to be directed. In this point in time, there's a lot of energy and effort being sent towards addressing the different types or the different ways that white supremacy affects us. And at the same time, a lot of those conversations are largely systemic and they need to happen. And we feel very clearly that white supremacy itself is also the bedrock of American education, period. It informs identity formation, period. So in refusing white supremacy, what we're going to be talking about today is how do we, as music educators, as people who are trying to advocate for children, how do we address the white supremacy within ourselves? And how do we make that a regular process in the same way that we would lesson plan, in the same way that we might even go through certain ways to prepare ourselves for class? How do we prepare ourselves for the discipline of refusing the white supremacy that is within ourselves? There's a quote. What is the quote again, Brent?
Ibram Kendi has a helpful way of identifying a racist policy, and he says that any policy that produces racially unequal outcomes is a racist policy. So that same concept applied to institutions would read, any institution which creates racially unequal outcomes is a racist institution. And we know that presently, and basically since the beginning of public and compulsory education in the United States, education as an institution has been producing racially unequal outcomes. And they're not randomly racially unequal. There's clear disparities between white students and students of color. So we're here essentially to talk about the role that we as music educators play in our institutions that we work within remaining to be white supremacist and racist institutions, which consistently, continually, perpetually prepare white students to maintain domination over students of color forever.
And thank you so much, Brent. So just to also let you know the character of this, we feel there's many ways to address this and many different ways that are effective and some that are ineffective. We are hoping that actually through personal narrative and story, we'll be able to highlight and give examples of what we are talking about. And at the same time, as we're highlighting those examples, we're going to encourage you all to be thinking about your own life stories and being able to apply these lenses. So just as we are beginning, there's two questions that we want you to kind of carry with you as we go into these stories. Like the first question is, how has or how is white supremacy impacting your students? Just kind of like, as we're going through this, even if you want to go ahead and write these kind of examples down, we do feel as though the work of this, while we are going through this process together, is going to be largely internal, and we're hoping to end in some ways with a commitment for a group of people to be saying, like, we will work on this, and then in some ways being able to continue to check in and refine this practice because it is so unpracticed. So question one, again, how has and how does white supremacy impact your students? Carry that with you. Think about it. And then also, as we go into these personal narratives, the second question is, how does or has white supremacy impacted you? So we're thinking about those two questions, your students and white supremacy and yourself. The questions are deliberately open because we think that there's just so many different ways for us to address these questions, and so many of them are valid, or at least have some sort of data that's going to give us clues onto how to address and deconstruct it and eventually abolish it. All right?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay, so what I'm going to do to try to sort of illustrate what we are asking everybody to do in their own way and in terms of their own life, I'm going to tell the same story twice. And this is a story about my growing up and eventually becoming a educator that teaches predominantly students of color, poor and working class students of color. So here's the first story. So I was born in 1986 in a town called Aurora, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver, Colorado. Aurora is presently considered the most diverse city in the United States. I was born to two working class parents. My father grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and my mother grew up after being adopted from a refugee camp in Germany after World War II. Also in a suburb of Aurora, Colorado. She was adopted by my grandfather, who was in the army and in Germany, hence he adopted her. Basically, elementary, middle, and high school, I went to the neighborhood schools. All three of those schools were like mostly white, but there were lots of students of color, and I would say like I had relationships with people of all race, gender, and sexual identities. If anything was not very diverse, it was class. It was basically middle working class area. After high school, I was talked into attending college by one of my childhood friends who I was in Cub Scouts with, and ended up going to Colorado State University, where I was, for lack of having any idea of what I wanted to study, placed into the business school. After 2 years, I found that I despised the business school, and so thought I despised college and considered dropping out. However, I read a text over one summer, which was the autobiography of Malcolm X, which sort of enlightened me to the fact that I had been raised in terms of diversity, sort of a like little utopian bubble, and that there was like real and significant problems of race and racism throughout the United States, and maybe that still existed. So I decided I would want to learn more about that in college, and I signed up for basically any class that had race or gender or power or politics in the title. And I ended up studying ethnic studies and political science. Because I came to love education through that experience, I decided that I wanted to teach, but I didn't want to teach to predominantly white students because I knew that schools that were mostly populated by students of color were very under-resourced, and I thought that the sort of just or right or moral thing to do would be to offer my skills and services to students of color in poorer schools, which is how I came to eventually teach spoken word poetry and audio production to students of color. And I basically did that for several years, and then became the director of programs at Youth on Record, which is what I'm doing now. That's the first version of the story. And now I'll tell this is the same story again. My name is Brent Adams. I was born and raised in Aurora, Colorado, by two parents who were raised also in Colorado, both on stolen land. The stolen land that my mother grew up on was awarded to her family because of my grandfather's efforts in supporting the American sort of imperialist endeavors in Africa. The farm that my father grew up on was stolen from indigenous people by the United States government and given to him for his services in World War II and imperialist pursuits in Asia. I grew up in a household where white supremacy reigned. Most of the lessons that I learned growing up within my household came through my father, and there are like three sort of particular ways in which he developed me as his son as a white supremacist. I'm going to talk about those in terms of three themes. The first was that my father ran our household in the same way that a king would his castle in England. And what I mean is, my white working class father transmitted whiteness and white supremacy to me as his son by demonstrating sovereignty within and over the realm of his house. The form my father's demonstration took was twofold. My father provided demonstration of his sovereignty as proof that his white working class male sovereignty existed, along with demonstration as a practical example of how white working class male sovereignty is established and maintained. The audience for my father's demonstration within our household was potentially anyone under or in relationship to his roof. So if you were in my father's house, he wanted you to know that he was in charge, and he would do that via various forms of domination. However, there was an attending audience for the second form of demonstration, which is how to dominate. And that was exclusively and specifically for me. In other words, my father demonstrated to potentially anyone within or in relationship to his home that he was in charge, but he demonstrated to me how to take charge. One way that he demonstrated his white working class male sovereignty within our home was by dominating all the members of our family as his chattel, or sort of as his property, dictating our roles and place under his authority and punishing us for stepping out of line. Another way in which my father demonstrated his white working class male sovereignty was by defending his castle from intrusion and or the threat of intrusion, while also identifying who and what qualified as an intruder. And what I was taught growing up was that intruders were those who themselves or property that they own, say for example, like a dog or their kids, anything they were responsible for controlling, crossed over the boundary of my white working class father's realm of sovereignty, his home or his land, and challenged his rule. I learned that one could become an intruder based on their actions by being in a home place that they did not belong. And I also learned from my father that there are those who are inherently intruders, are threats regardless of their action, and these intruders were defined both explicitly and implicitly in terms of racial identity. So for example, my father always sort of identified intruders as either in terms of their race, like Mexicans aren't supposed to be here, Black people aren't supposed to be here, or more euphemistic terms like foreigners should not be in the home, terrorists should not be in the home, criminals should not be in the home, which are all also racial terms. Finally, my father demonstrated his white working class male sovereignty within the home by enacting his own law within the realm of his home. So that is within the boundary of my father's property, my father acted as though an experience that he was exempt from following federal, state, and local laws. So my father outside of the home taught me to obey laws, but inside of the home would break them. And the clearest examples were in the forms of child abuse, but also on one occasion, my father killed one of our neighbor's dogs for crossing onto his property. So that's one sort of way my father within our house taught me white supremacy and how to become sort of white supremacist, how to begin occupying his position within the hierarchy. Additionally, he taught me the desire to dominate. So he transmitted whiteness and white supremacy to me by scaring, shaming, and humiliating me into his likeness. Beyond demonstrating domination within the home, he embedded the value of domination deep within me, within my psyche, by making me to feel worthless, powerless, and afraid, while providing only one way out of those feelings: to make others feel worthless, powerless, and afraid. In this way, he worked to ensure that I would carry on his legacy of white male domination even after I inevitably left his household and became free from his direct influence. The strategies he used to induce those feelings varied from physical violence or psychological terror to intense verbal and emotional abuse or subtle indications of wrongness or badness. I hated my father for the things he did to me and the ways he made me feel. However, my desire to desperately be free from those feelings was even more pressing. And unfortunately, the power dynamic my father created and drew me into contained multiple dichotomies that set up binary thinking. I could either be powerful or I could be powerless. I could be valuable or I could be worthless. I could be secure and confident or I could be afraid and humiliated. I could be proud or I could be ashamed. To master the power dynamic, I learned only two positions existed: dominator and dominated, perpetrator of violence versus victim of violence. Though theoretically I could have escaped, I might have considered accepting my lot as inferior, evading further admonishment by submitting to my father's domination. My father would not allow it. As I previously stated, he demonstrated to everyone that he was in charge, but he demonstrated to me how to be in charge. My mother, sister, and anyone my father intended to dominate could avoid punishment by simply submitting to him. However, I could not. I not only had to submit to him, accept his sovereignty and right to dominate me, but I also was required to demonstrate to him that I could get others emphasized as feminine and or inferior masculine, which included women, men of color, and queer or queered men, to submit to me. And that I could be dominating like him and therefore able to carry on his legacy. I learned that if I wasn't in control of people or situation around me like my father was, I wasn't establishing rigid boundaries of power, practicing white heterosexuality, protecting my property via inclusion and exclusion, that I was in danger of dying, feeling like I wanted to die, or feeling like I should die. Furthermore, the strategies used to induce fear, shame, and humiliation within me didn't cease until I dominated like he did. In my case, I was able to demonstrate to my father via sports that I could dominate and destroy others, and which was the moment sort of at which he accepted me and began to demonstrate that he loved me. And my ability to do that was sort of the day that my fear and shame subsided. Furthermore, I began to associate dominating others with physical trauma, with freedom from safety, fear, shame, and humiliation. Through this process of being punished with domination by my father and protected from that by dominating others, the desire to dominate moved gradually out of the realm of my father's expectation of me and into the realm of my own desire and mastery of dominating others. And then the third and final way, my father taught me white supremacy within the realm of our home was by privileging and insulating white male relationship. So my father transmitted whiteness and white supremacy to me as his son by constantly centering and recentering the identity of and relationship between white men, both in my growing up and depicting in the personal narrative written by me later, which is what I'm reading this from. Everyone, women, people of color, immigrants, queer folks, and trans folks exist merely as reference points and objects and opportunities of violent domination for creating and recreating white heterosexual male power. Eventually, I left my father's home, and as I sort of like came into racial consciousness, decided that I disagreed with his beliefs about race and gender and class and sexuality. And this is how I came to begin teaching students of color and poor neighborhoods and under-resourced schools. I had developed an anti-racist consciousness. However, even when I began teaching, all of these three lessons that my father taught me within our home, which is to rule the home as a castle, to lethally and forcefully defend it from intruders, and dominate everybody within it, sort of as property, dictating their roles and punishing them for stepping out of them. Teaching the desire to dominate, shaming in order to shaming and then provide shaming and humiliating while providing a model for a way out of that shame and humiliation by dominating others, and centering and privileging white male relationships manifested in my teaching practices, right? So when I first began teaching, I ruled my classroom as if it were my home. I dictated my students' roles and position under my hierarchy. I set the rules. I punished students if they broke the rules. I myself was not required to follow the same rules that I set for my students. When my students challenged my authority or my power, I would humiliate or shame them by sort of like demonstrating to the rest of the class that they were failing to sort of complete their assignments or failing to grow at the expected pace in the class, shaming, humiliating them, and then rewarding them if they were able to sort of dominate other students in terms of their performance, right? So I would compare students to each other to make one feel bad or wrong, so that they would improve on their performance based on my expectations. And then I privileged everybody's relationship to me. So the most important relationships in the classes were my relationship to my students. The most important thing that could occur in the class was that the students did what I asked them, or that they did what I told them. And mostly I tried to maintain that as a form of classroom management. That if I could create relationships to my students where they did exactly what I told them to, and they did not challenge me, that this was successful teaching. And it wasn't until and this is how I became to be a white supremacist music educator for students of color in poor and working class schools. The reason I tell you this story is that in the description for this talk, there were two terms: white fragility and racial hegemony. And white fragility and racial hegemony are two concepts that sort of enabled me to tell the story the first way that I did, right? And white fragility essentially refers to white people's emotional resistance to being able to reconcile that it's possible that there can be good people and engage in racist or white supremacist action, right? So when I tell the story the first way and I remove those elements of white supremacy from my whole life, I make myself out to be a good person, helping poor kids who wouldn't have help otherwise, right? And I allow myself to tell a story that the system is racist and white supremacist, and I just do everything I can to work against it, but it's too big for me to really challenge. The second term is racial hegemony. And racial hegemony is a state of domination in which the hierarchy of power racially becomes normalized and naturalized. And the ways in which the hierarchy of power racially maintains itself also becomes normalized and naturalized, right? So white supremacist domination just becomes classroom management, right? Shaming and humiliating students into submitting or shaming and humiliating each other instead of teaching a student a lesson or not taking any crap from my students, right? Or being tough and firm with my students. Or that's what it becomes. That white supremacist practice becomes that. And then establishing a relationship of domination as the primary relationship in the class between the students and me, right? Establishing myself as sort of their master in significant ways just looks like commanding and teaching respect, right? So we have very normalized and naturalized terms that we use to do white supremacy. And I want to say, you know, being in schools for a long time, I identify a lot of this in a lot of other white teachers and a lot of other white music teachers. Obviously, I don't engage in these practices now, which is why I can tell the story. But significantly, one of the ways we can refuse white supremacy in music education is by working through the boundary of white fragility, by sort of like removing the veil of racial hegemony so that we can identify white supremacy in our own music classrooms via our own music. Sorry, I figured it out. Okay, I don't know if the best thing to do now is questions or hand it over to Stefan, because he's going to approach the same concept via a very different experience and worldview.
So yeah. I want to talk about what it was like in my household. So in my house, every day when I woke up, I would look into the eyes of Sojourner Truth, Thurgood Marshall, Ella Baker, Charles Drew. My parents had covered my wall in portraits of exceptional African Americans. They wanted me to be able to see what my heritage, what my history was. Both of my parents were the first generation to go to college. My father was the first person in his town to complete middle school. Both of my parents went on from growing up in the Jim Crow South to achieving amazing things. My mother graduated valedictorian in a school where she and her brothers and sisters were sent to desegregated, where on the day of graduation, when she was called out and announced and was picking up her diploma and her accommodations, her accreditations, the principal, before handing her the diploma, turned to the entire crowd, especially like filled with my family members who were so proud of their daughter who'd become valedictorian. And in that moment, the principal took it upon herself, the white principal took it upon herself to look out into the crowd and say, "How dare you let this nigger take this from you?" Valedictorian. And so my mother took it from her. So in my household, there was a very strong belief, and my parents very much, since they grew up under Jim Crow, they're like, no, Stephan, I want you to understand, your blackness is a blessing. Your blackness means that your heritage is brilliance. Like, that is your birthright. I was raised to believe that the skin that I brought in gave me almost superpowers. And for most of my life, that has been an absolute gift, and it served me so well. My sister and I have been taught so many different lessons. My mother gave us the talk so many times. She was a lawyer who was educated from Yale. So she had all of these ideas about how to make her Black children safer in the world. The way that we spoke was our first line of defense. Every time that she got pulled over, she's like, "Watch this." And every time she would utterly disarm that police officer. That police officer would be dazzled to be hearing this incredible language coming out of this body that he wasn't expecting. And in that dazzling, whatever the crime was or the infraction, it disappeared. And my mother went on her way. She's like, "That's how you win." They're expecting one thing. We give them something else. My mother taught me and my sister that if you go into a room, one of the first things that you do, especially if it's a white room, you make yourself known with your brilliance. Because once you're known and once they see you, you can't be taken away without there being a tumult. You've become real. And you become real because you have stated how you matter and how you show up, and you've declared what your contributions are. I've been incredibly proud of that heritage, of that history, of the way that I was raised. And at the same time, as I'm doing this work, as I'm sitting down with my students, I started realizing how white supremacy was embedded even in that methodology. And I'm not saying it's not as though the methodology didn't work, but I'm also saying the way that my family had been demonstrating ways to be safe and visible was through exceptionalism. Now, what was the metric for that exceptionalism? Well, the metric as presented was to outdo the white standards, to be in some ways superior in every one of those metrics by which white people evaluate themselves, just to be better. But at the same time, that was still my measuring stick. And the reason that we're talking about these two kinds of stories is that it is so easy to believe that this is external, or to believe that maybe this is something for this group of people to address. But the reality is that this really is a bedrock for people who have lived in this country. And even in terms of exceptionalism is still an additional amount of effort, and it doesn't get us closer to abolition of white supremacy. And that's what we're trying to encourage all of us towards. It is not, even though it is pervasive, it does not make it an inevitable thing that it will always be. And so we were hoping that, like, even in talking about our two different stories, we're trying to examine. The first thing is, like this active center looking of skepsis, of like being able to look in ourselves and see white supremacy in the strata of our interior lives. And the other thing that we realize is like there aren't a lot of roadmaps for this process right now. And in this modern moment, when a lot of people are focusing on it, it's so easy to turn the aperture of our insight elsewhere. We know that there's a lot of pain here. We know that there's a lot of hurt here. And we also know that we can't do this work alone. So in many ways, this talk is also a hope for us to start creating a practice of being able to do this work and be able to look within and see where it is, to make sure that we don't unconsciously let this white supremacy speak out of our lives and harm and into our students and harm them in the process, further traumatize them in the process. Because we are of the mind that it doesn't matter what the genre of music is that we're teaching. It doesn't actually even matter what the course is. Any of these things, you can be teaching a class on straight up liberation, and white supremacy can be coming out of the basement from it. So in the same way that we know if we've experienced trauma in our lives or abuse in our lives and that goes unexamined, on the days when we start forming our own families, that trauma will be our first teacher, unless we are able to uproot it, discuss it, mitigate it, and then remove it.
Maybe, obviously it's difficult. Webinars are difficult for conversation or dialogue, which is typically like how we like to approach these topics. Maybe it's a good time to see if there are questions for clarity.
Yes.
I know I got a little jumbled up there for a second. Questions for clarity, and then additional questions maybe we can talk about and encourage you to think about, okay, so how do I make sure that beyond having anti-racist beliefs, I actually am doing anti-racism? So questions for clarity, come at us in the chat, and you can ask us questions about practices.
Yes.
Or even we could talk about how we can to do the self-examination to identify those problematics of white supremacy in us.
And I am just like seeing someone, like somebody said that I'm disgusted to see that the very thing that I'm trying to abolish is within us. It's like, okay, yes, and I think the real honest aspect of it, if we can be bold enough to be honest, is like, the answer is like, me too. This is the reason it's so pervasive. This is actually the water that we are all swimming in. That's why white supremacy has been around. And what Brent is talking about hegemony, it also makes it invisible. That invisibilization of it is what allows it to be so pervasive and unchallenged. So there's nothing necessarily easy about this work, but it is so, so essential. And we're really appreciative of all you being here. So I'd love, you got a question?
I see a couple in here. Thomas, I think you do the inner work all the time. I started my inner work in like 2007, and I identified that I was, white supremacy was still emerging in my practice in like probably today in problematic ways. Most recently, the way that I did an examination was I looked at my relationship to my father over time through the theoretical lenses of racial formation, which is a theory of how race is created as a category and takes on meaning by Richard Omi and Howard Winott. They're sociologists. Racial formation, Richard Omi, Howard Winott, and then also looking at racial formation specifically in terms of whiteness, which is construction of whiteness. So I literally wrote out narratives from my childhood where my father was just being my father, just being in the house, just teaching me lessons, And then I looked at all of those instances through the lens of racial formation, through the lens of construction of whiteness. And I was able to identify them as actually racist and white supremacist practices that were working to form me as an agent of white supremacy. We're working to ensure that I would continue my father's legacy of white male domination in the world. That was a several year process, actually. But that was very helpful and illuminating. And I missed stuff, and I let my friends look at it and catch stuff that I didn't see. And I had to really, I just had to accept, I had to stop rejecting the pain of thinking that I have been a bad person, right? It's easy for me to be like, oh, I work in these schools that are so underserved and disadvantaged, and it's so hard. There's so many students, but I try and I don't get paid a lot. And I can tell that story to so many people and just get so much like psychological wage for that, right? Just like people paying me like, your work must be so much rewarding. You're such a good person, right? I couldn't do it, et cetera, et cetera. And I just have to like stop doing that, right? Because that's what allows me to continue to tell myself the lie that I'm not participating in white supremacy, even though the institutions I work in are absolutely producing white supremacist outcomes. So there's a way I did some inner work. Richard Omi, Howard Winott, Racial Formation. Construction of Whiteness, like the sort of original text on that is Ruth Frankenberg, who wrote White Women, Race Matters, so the social construction of whiteness. All of David Rodiger's stuff on class and whiteness, anything from the field of whiteness studies. Anything, I would say check, if you're white, like me, the field of whiteness studies has a lot of mechanisms for critical self-examination. And then I think there was one also things. We were looking for like a working definition of white supremacy.
And somebody put a pretty dope one in there.
I see a question. Oh, working definition of white. So white supremacy is a belief system, right? It's the idea that white people are superior in every way, that they are superior intellectually, that they are physically superior in terms of like physical strength and speed and beauty. And then significantly that they are morally superior. Physically superior, morally superior, intellectually superior. And then there are structures of white supremacy which work to create society that reflects that thinking. So none of those things are actually true, which is why we have to have systems and structures of white domination to make sure society looks as if white people are superior, which places white people in control, in government, at the head of businesses, owning the most land, as your principals and your vice principals, etc.
And the first link that I put in without context, and I apologize. One of the texts that we've been using, particularly in training all of our teachers, is "We Want to Do More Than Survive" by Dr. Bettina Love. And so it's a kind of like listing out all these different abolitionist teaching practices and different ways that it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And we found that to be helpful enough that that's what we're training all of our teachers in. And it's just a beautiful framing around this, and also beautiful framing around the possibilities of the alternative, which also in this work is very, very important. And I'm sorry that we didn't highlight it earlier, but the capacity to imagine and create an alternative is abolitionist. In the process of doing this work, we need to be able to go in and do the hard work of transformation. And at the same time, it's the same thing that we do when we're teaching our students in our ethnic studies classes about oppression. It's also incredibly important to teach about the resistance to the oppression. In the same way, if we are going into this process, we have to keep in mind that we are resisting white supremacy. It will be difficult, but this is an active resistance that we're also modeling for ourselves, our community, and our students. And that opens a creative possibility for something else, which is a lot of times left out when we get to the academic and intellectualizing of this work. But there's magic, literal magic, in being able to explore the possibilities and imagine something else. So in the same time that you're going through that process, understand that even going through the process is an act of resistance. And if you can, give yourself some bit of morale for that, because we need all of us to continue down this path.
I see a question here. Rhonda's asking, as a teacher of color, please give examples of how I can help empower my student in self-love without the trying to push to be better than attitude.
So actually, Rhonda, I'm actually, there's just so many different ones that are running through my head at this point in time.
I would
Go ahead.
I would say two sources of that have been helpful for us is Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive, and also Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. Both talk about, so actually for students of color and particularly Black students, the quality of education for Black students presently is not on par with the quality of education for Black students previous to Brown v. Board of Education. So one of the worst things that happened for Black education was when Black students were forced to leave their Black educators and begin learning from white educators who had entirely different values and goals in education. But both Bettina Love and Bell Hooks remind us of what Black teachers were doing with their Black students previous to desegregation, that helped their students to be incredibly intellectually and politically, I would say even like emotionally and psychologically strong, and to a significant degree, like happy and fulfilled within their educational experience. So I know those aren't explicit practices, but strategies from previous to the desegregation, from looking at Bettina Love and also looking at Bell Hooks.
And so I'm also going to throw in a link. Bettina Love has been doing YouTube live sessions with other abolitionist teachers, and I found them to be very amazing and encouraging, and you get to hear from a lot of people who are in this community of practice. And so I just shared the link for that as well.
Stephen, here's a question for you.
Oh, where's the question? Oh, yeah. So this is, I'm actually.
You want me to, I'm gonna read the question.
Oh, yeah, please read the question. Yes, sir.
So the question is, Stephen, wouldn't you say that the be better than the rest philosophy instilled by your mother is why you are successful and are able to teach us how to be better?
So, for one, I think it worked beautifully for me. And at the same time, like, I'm able to realize that what my parents were trying to do is make something from nothing. They'd been educated by Jim Crow, and they were like, there is no way that we want to pass this on. In the same way that, like, both of my parents came up in very abusive households and deliberately as a team decided not to pass that on. So at the same time, for me, I think it worked. And then I'm also asking the question, what more do I not want to pass on? I do think that there's a way for me to encourage my students towards excellence without necessarily having to make whiteness the measuring stick. I think it worked okay for me, but I think in some ways you might find that that has parallels to the model minority formation, which has its own limitations as well, because you could argue that in some ways it does work. But at the end of the day, the other things that don't work is that it didn't actually make me safe. The hope was to make me safe, but I actually can't promise. My parents couldn't promise that it would keep me safe, and there's many situations where it did not. So it's not that I think that there was something wrong with it. I'm trying to think of what is the yes and to maybe abolish that measuring stick and be able to create another level of excellence that doesn't come from trying to, that doesn't come from metrics that came from the plantation.
As we look, are you looking for another question?
Yeah, well, I've got one that can you reconcile relationships with those who have instilled your white supremacy?
Oh,
You're all over this one.
can I okay, so what's my relationship to my dad now? Like, can I love him as my father with the understanding that he raised me in ways that were violent and abusive and made me and led me sort of down a path of white supremacy? Yeah, I think what I have to do is have the same compassion for my father that I have for myself. But I also, along with that compassion, I have to be unwilling to give up on working to still transform him away from white supremacy. Even though like he doesn't have as much direct influence now. He's like 73 years old. I think, yeah, I have to have the same sort of compassion. And if we look at it, Stefan sort of talked about like a lot of it came through trauma. And the trauma that my father experienced at the hands of his father was in significant ways like far more intense than the trauma that I experienced from him. And so if white supremacy makes its way from our brains and like sort of ideas and our belief systems into our body and nervous system, right? Via trauma. And what I mean is my father literally scared me to death to ensure that I could dominate others. And so if the domination of others, which is my white supremacist practice, comes from a traumatic wound, and significantly all traumatic wounds are somehow related to survival, I know that ending that white supremacist practice requires the healing of that traumatic wound. And so in myself and in my father, if the white supremacist, almost the unconscious action, will not be interrupted without loving healing. So yes, I think you can reconcile those relationships and maybe even are responsible to, if you want to actively resist white supremacy. It is not easy, you know, but I think possible. And I mean, I think we're responsible to it in ways.
Yeah.
Knowing that my white father continues to be a white person in the world and a danger as long as he's still white supremacist.
So real quick, there's a question about like when I said white measurements, it was just literally saying like you have to do everything better than white people, kind of a thing was in some ways what was being offered to me. So it wasn't necessarily like a straight set of metrics. It's just like I had to be best in all categories in comparison to white people in the room. This other question, white supremacy. White supremacy affects many of my students as Black, Hispanic, and Native students either don't know or perhaps more importantly, don't really care about their heritage, culture, power. How do we get them to care and understand that, especially in regards to a musical education? That's from David. What say you, Brent?
Oh, what?
Oh, you didn't hear the question?
I was reading another one. I thought you were
Oh,
going to
you're
answer
reading
that
another.
one.
All right. So, one of the things that we find that's really fascinating, especially when we're teaching ethnic studies, is we use music as our primary documents in ethnic studies. Because for one, it's extraordinarily accessible to where the students are, and then interrogating a song can give you so much information about the context, what that song came out of, what it's responding to, and in the same way, it visibilizes the contributors. I think for a lot of students now, so much of their identity has been so long relegated and associated with inferiority that it's not a surprise that it's distasteful or something that they're not excited about. We've seen many times within this country different movements that have offered a countervailing narrative, and it's been incredibly successful throughout. And so I do think that in some ways there's within music education, it's not genre specific, right? Because like you can teach the genres of the ethnicities of the children in the room and still do it in such a way that it's incredibly offensive, right? But at the same time, I think there's also a way to kind of truly dig into what is that music coming from. There's one way that you can teach funk and you can get a great performance out of it. There's another way to teach the origins of funk and the politics of it. And we're of the mind that the more full-throated that we can get in talking about these contributions, then it doesn't just become a thing of like curating marketable items such as songs. Now we're actually talking about stories of people contributing to America, and many times the songs themselves are acts of resistance, which is another beautiful thing and a beautiful lens to be able to offer in any of these contexts.
I see another question. I also want to just say at this point, I want to remind you to
yes.
take the survey
Yes.
after the session, which I believe is linked by the LKR, the Little Kids Rock team.
Yeah, we have a wonderful moderator, Clayton, and he would be very pleased if you all made sure to put in your evaluations. We are going to follow up with Little Kids Rock to see if anybody's interested in trying to maybe even create like an email group for a community of practice. Because like we are presenting this as people who are just trying this process, and we really do want to have as many minds on this so we can refine this and actually maybe come up with something that is very actionable and relatable to folks. Got one more?
Well, there's two I want to address, but essentially I want to address Ryan's comment.
Okay.
Ryan says, in every workshop that I have attended, there is a constant flow of comments in the chat window from white people trying to demonstrate or convince us BIPOCs how woke or progressive or democratic they are. There's a constant need to validate oneself and how they're white, but not like the other white people. And yet throughout all of it, they claim that they want to learn how to do better or be better. Please understand that I mean this in the best way possible, but stop talking. Listen, not hear us. Listen to us. Open your ears. Stop trying to grab the mic from BIPOC and learn of an experience that is not yours. This is not about you. You might run a great class and have a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate, but it doesn't matter how many books you read or how many degrees you earn or how many songs by BIPOC that you include in your curriculum or how many Black people you befriend, love, or know. I want to echo that sentiment as a white person. It is very easy to distance ourselves, and this is what we want to do because of our white fragility. We want to distance ourselves from the harm of whiteness and white supremacy by demonstrating constantly that like we are not the one, right? That that's what's happening when like white teachers want to tell all their white friends about how they work with poor Black and brown kids. The way for white people, the way out of white supremacy is out of the center of everything, right? And so I guess what I want to say is that out of white supremacy requires a lot of humility and listening and receiving, and fighting the urge within yourself to reject criticism from people who can see your whiteness and racism far more clearly than you can, which typically have lived their lives within the BIPOC community.
You said there's one more that you want to bring?
And then there was a question. We have 3 minutes. I don't know if we can do it.
Try it. You got it. I believe
Where'd the question go? It's Claudio's question. I'm trying to find it. It's basically like, how do we teach? Oh, here it is. I got it.
Okay.
Do traditional ensembles such as band and orchestra and its Eurocentric repertoire instill white supremacy and elitism? How do we as educators balance exposing students to the beauty in this music and its white composers while decolonizing its repertoire and being culturally responsive in our classrooms? We disagree on this a little bit.
We do disagree.
I think absolutely traditional ensembles such as band and orchestra instill the values of white supremacy. They are a culturally supremacist celebration of white European Western cultural practice. And that doesn't necessarily mean we can't teach them in such a way that they don't harm students. And I think, one, we do have to decenter them, right? We have to stop teaching them as like good music, and we need to teach them as white music, which is now centered because of violent institutionalization of whiteness. So we have to decenter them, and also we cannot teach them without teaching them through a critical, racialized, and historicized and politicized lens, right? We have to sort of like common sense them or denaturalize or denormalize them.
Yeah. Hey, y'all, we really would love to continue this conversation as much as possible. We do have the real limitation of time. Thank you so much. We hope that this was a good use of your time. It was wonderful us to be able to see your comments. We do apologize that we did not have a way to make this more of a dialogue. That's truly our method, but we had no idea how many people were even going to be a part of this. So this is not the way that we normally conduct any kind of conversation, but thank you for bearing with us, and we hope that it was fruitful. And we will try to see if there's some way for us to somehow kind of keep in touch to like kind of build maybe a cohort who's looking into this process, because it does need to be developed. And a lot of healing and good could come from it. And now is the time more than ever. All right. Thank you all so much.